Hello, this is Jeff from leathercraft, and today we're going to explore some of the best ways you can go ahead and use your laser engraver when working with leather. I'm going to share with you some of the pitfalls you might run into and how to avoid them, and I'm going to share some of the ways I deal with leather, and maybe you can adopt some of the ideas that I've been using. So let's go ahead and get started. Since I'm going to be cutting this leather, I'm going to go ahead and use a honeycomb bed. This is an aluminum bed, so I'm not able to use magnets, so I'm using these pins to secure the leather down. This is a good idea so it doesn't move in any sense of the measure. This way, if you're working outside and it's windy, or if you just happen to bump the table, you'll be okay. Everything will stay where it's supposed to be. Sometimes when you're using thinner leathers, it becomes kind of ripply along the edges. So I wanted to find a way to keep everything down and even. So here I'm using popsicle sticks and magnets. The popsicle sticks are nice and long, so the longer the better because they'll hold more material down. And the magnets, of course, keep pressure onto the popsicle sticks. This keeps the leather all completely down and it prevents any problems while cutting. You could run into situations where the leather is pushed by the laser module if you don't secure the leather down. Because the leather's not always even, there's parts of it that are higher. Here you'll see the laser module snag onto the leather, there you go, and it totally pushed it out of the way. This is why it's important to secure your leather as low as possible. I actually wet my leather before I cut or engrave it. It keeps all the edges down, and sometimes I don't have to force it down. One of the greatest aspects of using a laser on leather is it is so precise and it can cut things that most people can never cut on leather. This is a design right here that seems impossible to cut unless you're using some sort of laser device. I don't see how a human would be able to cut this out, but there are some really talented people out there. So I'm not going to say that it's impossible, but it's got to be very difficult. Okay, I wanted to share something about this. If you see on the bottom part, there's a lot of smoke buildup, but on the top there isn't because I turned the air assist on at this point. I wanted to show you the difference between having the air assist on and off. So the bottom is without air assist and the top is with air assist. All is not lost though because the smoke damage actually comes off pretty easy as long as it's not burnt, and normally it's just smoke. So here I'm just using water and a toothbrush, and I've had a lot of success with water. I haven't had to use any other solution. There are people that use vinegar, which I understand works really well. You could also use a low adhesive masking tape, which works very well. But I've found if you use the right amount of air assist and the right level of power and speed on your laser, you don't have to go ahead and add that extra expense of using the masking tape. Here it is after it's all dried up. This is fine. It can be used for any project. And if you're going to dye it, then you really don't have to worry about it at all. But this looks good. If you notice, a lot of that smoke came off, enough to be able to use it for whatever you're needing it for. I wanted to give you an example why I wet the leather before I go ahead and cut or burn it. You see how the laser pushed that leather out of the way like that? Now we're going to take this same piece of leather and wet it on the front and back, and we're going to go ahead and put it back on the honeycomb laser bed. Everything looks a lot better, but if you have an end piece that looks like this, which is at the side of the actual hide, you want to go ahead and cut that off. It's not worth trying to pin that down and ruining your project. Just go ahead and get rid of it. It's not worth risking the leather because if that laser module snags onto that, you've wasted all this material. Here's that same piece of leather. If you noticed, I don't have any pins holding it down or magnets because the water really keeps it down really well. Notice the water does not get in the way of the cutting or burning. In fact, there's less smoke damage when you go ahead and use water than when you leave it dry. It's much easier to clean off if necessary. One of the potential pitfalls in using water to hold things down on your laser bed is that you can dye leather when it's wet, of course, but it does take on a different appeal. I found that it's darker. So if you dye leather that's wet, when it dries, it's going to be darker than if you just dyed it when it was not wet. So just keep that in mind. Some people actually use the technique of wetting leather before they dye. Just remember, it's going to give you a different color. And go ahead and experiment with it. Take a piece of leather and wet it and see what happens when you dye it compared to a dry piece of leather. So keep that in mind depending on what you want to do. Sometimes I'll let it dry. Actually, most of the time, I'll let it dry overnight, so I'll cut it the night before. Getting the leather wet works so well, but you don't have to. Remember, you can use pins or magnets with popsicle sticks. All right, let's talk about the edges. Now, the edges are going to be burnt, and you're not going to want to leave them like that. So you're going to have to take sandpaper to them, and that's what I do. You're not going to be able to finish the edges unless you go ahead and scrape that stuff off. It's a very thin layer of burnt, so it's very easy to get off, but you want to get it off because you're not going to be able to do the edges like you're used to doing. You know, as leather crafters, we love doing edges, or I should say we love when an edge comes out great. Sometimes it could be quite tedious to do them, but it's always a great feeling once they're done and you look at them and it came out really nice. But you got to get rid of that stuff. As you see, I have a sanding wheel and it came off real easy, but I'm telling you, a regular piece of sandpaper is not going to take you very long at all. It comes off really easy. All right, let's talk about the soot that ends up inside the stitching holes. This is a white thread, and I want to show you how it shows up on the thread. Here, let me zoom in on you. I'm using white thread here because I wanted to give you an example. You see all that soot there that's built up on there? If you're going to be sewing with a thread that is going to be white or anything that's, not very dark, you might not want to cut the holes out with the laser. You can mark them, in other words, engrave instead of cut, and it'll be very helpful. All the holes will be there, and you'll be able to just go ahead and use a punch to go ahead and get rid of the holes. Of course, you have the added work of having to use a punch, but that's okay. That's what we're used to anyway, and it's going to look a lot better. If you're going to use a dark thread, then it's fine, really. If you're going to use a dark brown or a black thread, it's not going to get in the way. You're not even going to notice it. But when you start using lighter threads, it's going to be a little sketchy. You don't want to do it if you could help it. If you decide to engrave the stitching holes instead of cutting them, I want to share some things that were helpful for me, with you. That way it'll speed up your situation. All right, so you see here I have red and blue. The blue is the stitching holes and the red is the rest of the card wallet. And if you look in the cut layers section over here, I have them both set up for cutting, which means I have it in line mode instead of fill mode. And the speed power is at 400 millimeters a minute and 80% power. I have this one set up for 90 right now. Doesn't have to be. 80 would be fine for this laser. So what I first want to do is make sure that I take the blue layer and I'm going to go ahead and change this. I'm going to change this to, let's go with 7,000 millimeters. And let's go with 60% power. Because it's not important for this to be dark. We just want to be able to see it. And let's go ahead, of course, change this to fill. Now, when I hit OK, you notice that these blue dots right now are filled in. Another thing you want to do that's very important, there's a few different settings. Now, if you look right here, you have this choice of fill all shapes at once, which is what I would normally do if I was cutting something or engraving something. It all depends on the project, but I find 99% of the time I'm using fill all shapes at once. You could fill all groups together, which means you could group different aspects of the design together and it'll fill those areas take priority. And then you have fill shapes individually. I'm going to click fill shapes individually under these circumstances and I'll explain why. All right, the reason why is because if we say fill shapes all at once, these holes on the side, the laser will just keep going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and it will be adding a lot of time that we don't need. Since I have everything set up as fill shapes individually, it'll go ahead and laser engrave each one of these individually, and it'll be a lot faster than doing it back and forth, back and forth. So it'll save a lot of time. In fact, we could see how much time we'd be saving. So if I go ahead and hit preview, you see down here, it says 5 minutes and 39 seconds as it is right now. All right, so if I go ahead and go back to fill all shapes at once, and then we go to preview, you'll see now it's up to 9 minutes and 9 seconds. So that's one of the ways of shaving off time under these circumstances. Let's just make sure by going back. There it is, 5:39. Now another thing that I'll do will help you align the leather that you pick, plus it'll help you decide how much leather you actually have to cut out, because obviously your goal is not to waste leather. So I'll go ahead and click on the box icon, and I'll line up my guidelines with the top and side of the actual pattern, and I'll go ahead and create a box around that, and I'll meet all the sides on the top and bottom, so it's going to be exactly the size, and that is in red and black. So now you can see the black box right there. So that represents the full space. I'm going to put this on top because I prefer the black line on top. Now, if you could see, that represents the full space of everything we'll be cutting. And if I click on it, it'll show me the measurements up here. It's 4.0 inches and the height is 6.9 inches. I like to add a 1/2 inch to each side just so I know that I'm going to have enough leather without wasting a lot of leather. So when I go to cut out the leather piece for this cutting, I'm going to go ahead and cut out a 4.5 inch piece of leather width, and I'm going to cut out under the circumstances, this is 6.9, I'll go ahead and cut out a 7.5 inch piece of leather. So my leather entirely will be 4.5 inches width and 7.5 inches wide. That way I know that it's not going to waste a lot of leather. Next, I'll go ahead and shut off the blue and red layers so it'll only use the black layer as a guide. So when I click on the laser to run, it's only going to do this pattern. And I have it at the speed of 1,000 millimeters a minute, and the power is only at 2.0. That's not enough to cut or even to leave any line on the leather. And the reason I do that is I want to be able to see the guide of the actual laser as I center this piece of leather. And I'll go ahead and film while I do that so you can see what I'm talking about. And then when I'm done lining it up, I'll go ahead and shut off the black layer, and I'll turn on the blue and red layers. So now it will no longer engrave the black layer, and it will just do what I'm asking it to do, which is the blue holes it's going to fill and the red line it's going to cut. All right, let's go ahead and do it. All right, if you ever find that you're using your laser and the holes aren't pushing out and they just didn't cut out entirely, or you find you have to rip your pattern out of the leather because it didn't cut all the way, well, it's time to clean the lens of your laser. On the most part, they all seem to come apart the same way. There's a few bolts that you have to undo or just screw things off. This one I'm unscrewing the air assist nodule, and inside right there is the lens. Here, I'll go ahead and zoom in on it. As you can see, it's a little cloudy, but nothing a little alcohol and a little cotton swab won't be able to take care of. First, roll the cotton swab a little bit up so it's all tight on top of the stick. And go ahead and add some alcohol. I use isopropyl alcohol. Anything above 75 or 75 above would be great. Now go ahead and stick it onto the laser lens and swirl it around. As you see, a bunch of dirt came off there. And then what you want to do is take the other side of the Q-tip and dry it up a little bit. Now if you notice, this is the same piece of leather I cut that other piece out of, same power settings. Everything is running much smoother this time. There's a lot of smoke when you cut leather, so cleaning your lens is very much a good idea. It made a big difference. It's like new again. And final tip for this video, you might have heard me say it before in other reviews, but Any laser where this piece actually comes off of the laser module, it gives you so much more headroom and less area to cling on to the actual leather, and it makes it so much easier to engrave with a lot less chances of anything going wrong. If you haven't bought a laser yet, you might want to think about that when you're looking for one. Once again, thank you very much for watching this video. I hope it was helpful for you. These are some situations that I've run into while I was using the laser with the engraver. Hopefully this video will help keep you from wasting any leather. I know these ideas really helped me a lot, and as I come up with new ideas, I will go ahead and make another video on this topic. Take care, everybody.